Hey, it's great to see you again, and thank you for joining me. My name is Carlos, and I co-pastor, and I'm the youth pastor here at St. Croix Christian Center. We want to continue in our devotional series called The Flip Side. And I introduced a verse to you last time in Isaiah that God's ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts. And so he declares this. And so with that understanding how God has his way and his thoughts and how he does things in our lives. So I'm going to draw from an experience that I think most of us have read about in an event as well. Everyone's heard of Joshua in the Bible in the Old Testament, and we know the story of Jericho. I remember hearing the story as a kid, and I got to tell you, I remember the first time it didn't make sense to me. And for a lot of things, when we're walking with God and we're having a journey with God, the way he does things and his thoughts on things are different than ours. But in the end, God has a plan and God has a purpose. And so what I want to remind us of is that God often flips expectations to demonstrate his power. So that it's not about you or me or our giftings, even though he gives us those things. But if we really understand who God is, everything that we say and everything that we do, if we love him, is all to glorify him and bring him the glory. So let me share with you here out of Joshua 6. It says, "Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men.'" Look at how God talks already in his thoughts and his way, he already knows. For us, we're just playing catch up. This is where it involves trust. And so it says, "March around the city once with all the armed men." So they came ready. "Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets and ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in." Now, I got to be honest with you. As a kid, I thought, oh, this is so cool. The walls come tumbling down and all that. You've got to understand how thick those walls were. And the fortification of a fortress is not just some little Lego building set. This was massive and formidable. And I've got to be honest with you. As you read it as an older person, as an adult, you're thinking, okay, so this is God's plan, right? Go around with armed men. You're not, no catapults, no, artillery or arrows or, they had their swords with them, but that was it. And then they were supposed to go around once each time for 6 days. And on the 7th day, go around 7 times. And then they were supposed to shout and blast trumpets. Like, who brings trumpets to a war? Right? I mean, some of you could say, well, technically they do, right? You've seen the charge of the Light Brigade, and you see those different things in history, right? And that. But I be honest with you, it just doesn't make sense, right? Here's God flipping the narrative, saying, watch, you're going to do this the way I'm going to ask you to do this, and if you obey me and trust me, you're going to see me work. And that's the whole key of this series, to remind us that God just flips the whole thing on the other side to demonstrate his power and his way and his thought. So, of course, you know what happens in the story. The wall comes tumbling down and they go into the promised land. And I think this really accentuates really some important things, is that the victory belongs to who? To God. Now, we get to rejoice in that, but the glory goes to him. The victory about this was not so much that they went around the walls, and that's great. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But the first thing is that the victory, in this sense, the glory, goes to God. The other thing is I wanted to point out is that there is obedience over human logic, right? Logically, it doesn't make sense. Who brings a trumpet and just walks around a fortress? Hello? That doesn't make sense, right? But yet in God's economy, it did, because he had a plan. You know what else? Faith in action. Sometimes you just got to trust the Lord. When it doesn't make sense, you just trust the Lord. Trust him. And I would also think that there's a power in worship, and there's a power in silence. As they went, I imagine when they marched around, they just marched in the first couple of days. All they did was basically march around in silence. Maybe they chatted, maybe they didn't. I don't know. But there's a power in silence, right? There's a power in that. You're still worshiping the Lord. You can sit at home. You can be at the altar in church and just have a moment of silence before the Lord. There's something about that. But also worship. Worship just doesn't mean music and singing songs. Worship is a lifestyle. And I would imagine, and I would know actually, that there is power in the way we live our lives. If we're seeking after the Lord and going after everything that he has for us, and we say, Lord, you know what? I'm just going to trust you. I don't think the way you do. I don't know your ways because they're not my ways, but I'm going to trust you. And so it bears repeating again, just out of the verse there in Isaiah that I shared before. Just like the Lord said that my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither your ways, my ways, declares the Lord. And I just want to remind you, that even though it doesn't make sense, God is doing something on the flip side of this. When it defies human logic, when it defies things that we just can't even get our heads wrapped around, here's God moving through the obedience of his people. And that's important, that we obey him. Look at what God can do. So I want to encourage you today that even though his thoughts are not our thoughts and his ways not our ways, he's still working on our behalf. And he knows. He understands that we don't always understand. He gets it. But he wants you to know that his plan will be completed. Trust him today and be blessed.